So, welcome to this episode of Evidence of Greatness. As you can see here, I chose to talk about a study called The Effect of Solution-Focused Counseling on Violence Rate and Quality of Life of Pregnant Women at Risk of Domestic Violence, a randomized controlled trial. And as you can see, these are the authors down below. One of the reasons that I chose this article to look at is because it presents a pretty simple study about does solution-focused brief therapy work with those who have experienced domestic violence, and there's a couple of really important takeaways, I think. So I wanted to get into that just a little bit. So they start with kind of doing a bit of a literature review, and I think there's some really important takeaways for each of us as clinicians. They cite a couple of things from the World Health Organization that say things like 35% of women worldwide are at risk for domestic violence, basically a third of women. And I think that's probably a bit of a conservative estimate. But they also say that 38% of women's homicides each year are committed by their spouses. And so obviously, that's a huge portion of women who are being killed by their intimate partner. And then this study this statistic is specific to Iran because that's where this study is being conducted. But they say 52% of pregnant women in Iran have reported at least one incident of domestic violence. That's a huge portion as well. And I think a couple of the takeaways, right, from these statistics is that we as clinicians are very likely to be working with women who are experiencing domestic violence, who are in unsafe situations. Oftentimes we get asked as clinicians, as researchers, does solution-focused work with people who are in domestic violence situations? And I think that this is a study that impacts that. But I think one of the things that we need to be thinking about, one of the implications is it's very likely that each of us has at least one woman who is in this situation. And I do want to highlight as well, I do understand that there are men who are also the victims of domestic violence. But that isn't what this study was about. But again, it's very likely that we will be interacting with people who have experienced or who are experiencing domestic violence, because obviously that's an impetus oftentimes for people to come to get help. In addition, one of the things that they talk about is that violence includes, but isn't limited to, physical, psychological, or sexual abuse, activity that's limiting. So limiting access to resources, limiting access to friends, families, other support networks, denying autonomy, letting people make their own decisions, and restricting access to life facilities, like going to the hospital or those kinds of things. So they have a fairly broad definition of what is included in domestic violence when they look at it for this study. So one of the things that this begs the question, obviously, is if there are so many people who are experiencing domestic violence, does solution-focused brief therapy count as an effective form of treatment? So they then get into the methodology of the study and what they were looking at. And they did, in essence, a single blind randomized controlled trial. And that means the people who are in the groups, they are unaware of the differences between the groups, what's happening in one group versus the other group. They're blind to the treatment that they're going to get. So in order to be included in this study, they had to have been the victim of minor to medium levels of domestic violence. So they couldn't have high levels of domestic violence. And again, that's a safety issue, not so much a research issue. All of the women in the study were between the ages of 18 and 27. Each of them were less than 27 weeks pregnant, but all of them were pregnant. They needed to be fully literate in order to engage and answer the questions that were part of the study. And then they needed to live in this specific city, and that's because that's where the research was being taken place. Some of the other criteria are that they needed to have been married for at least 1 year. They couldn't have been receiving other psychological services or mental health services as in conjunction to what they were receiving as part of this study. They couldn't have any underlying illnesses that might be a confound to this study, and they needed to currently be living with their partner, so they couldn't be separated from their partner. So that's how they determined who could be included. Now, they also said that this is a randomized controlled trial, so they randomized who went into which group, and there was a lot of explanation about how they did that randomization, but ultimately that divided into two groups. There was a control group and a treatment group. The control group got no treatment until after the research was completed, and at that time, then they were offered the solution-focused group as an option. And they didn't really talk about how many of those control group members chose to receive that or not, but they were given the option to participate. The treatment group, on the other hand, was given 6 weeks of solution-focused brief therapy. These 6 weeks of services were provided. They were held on a weekly basis for 90 minutes. Now, one of the caveats that I want to talk about as far as the methodology goes is that according to the article, it looks like there was some psychoeducation that was done in the first and second week of the curriculum. They were told a little bit about quality of life and why they were measuring quality of life. And they were also told a little bit about solution-focused brief therapy and how it worked. So it wasn't a strictly solution-focused approach in that they just jumped in and started with the intervention. There was a bit of psychoeducation that occurred prior to the solution-focused work. And then what they did is they did a 6-week follow-up with both groups. So once the treatment group had finished, they waited for 6 weeks, and then they measured both groups to see was there a statistical difference in 2 variables, particularly. And one was the quality of life, and the other was in domestic violence, incidences of domestic violence. And so we'll get a little bit into both of those as we go. The sample size that they started with was a total of 90 women. They put 45 women in each of the groups, 45 in the control group, 45 in the treatment group. And over the course of the study, 4 women in each group dropped out. So by the end of the analysis, there were 41 women in each group, which is actually a very pretty high retainment rate, very low recidivism rate. So they issued to all of the women 3 measures. One was the demographic and reproductive checklist. So this was just to check, in essence, on their and their partner's age. Their socioeconomic status came up quite a bit in the study, but then also other factors around their pregnancy. Was this a first-time pregnancy? Was it a pregnancy that they were a planned pregnancy versus a non-planned pregnancy, and those kinds of things. The second measure that they gave was the conflict tactic scale, which is a very common scale to measure conflict within couple relationships. One difference that they instituted within this study is that typically the conflict tactic scale is a measure of the last 12 months. And they shortened that as they asked people to participate in this study to the last 3 months. And the rationale, although they didn't get into the rationale for why they did that, I assume that it was connected to because they wanted to know during pregnancy. Because this was a study that was all about pregnant women, they wanted to know about conflict within the relationship during the pregnancy. So that's that. And then the last one was the health-related quality of life questionnaire, which is the SF36. And that's, again, kind of measures the quality of life of these individuals. They did then statistical analysis, and they did a couple of paired t-tests and those kinds of things, but really where they drew a lot of their results were from an AMCOVA, which is an analysis of covariance. And they were looking at the covariance between violence and the quality of life. So if you want to get more into the statistics, you can kind of look at how they did that. Then we get to the results, and the results, they kind of in essence, looked at the difference between the baseline measure when they started the study to the 6-week follow-up. We don't get any data up immediately after the treatment. We only get 6 weeks post-treatment. And then they really emphasize the results of the treatment group, and that makes a lot of sense because the no treatment group didn't really they didn't have any intervention that happened, so we would assume that they would stay the same. But in essence, they looked at 2 different types of violence. They showed the psychological violence and they showed the physical violence. And with psychological violence, it had decreased significantly at a statistically significant rate to a level of 0, in essence, at follow-up. And the physical violence also did decrease a bit, but not at a statistically significant level. And one of the reasons that you might, one of the explanations for this is that if you look, there wasn't a whole lot of physical violence that was happening at baseline. So there, in essence, we kind of hit a floor effect. There wasn't really a whole lot, so there wasn't a lot of room for that rate to decrease. But nonetheless, violence overall dropped statistically significant to a level of 0. And one of the things that I think is really important to talk about as far as these rates go is that keep in mind that this research was done with the women who were pregnant, the victims of the violence. And so it's interesting to think that they were receiving solution-focused brief therapy and in some sense returned home in a changed way. And that then had further impacts on changing the relationship dynamic in so much that the violence between them and their partner decreased. And so again, I don't want to make the connection of they had an impact or they were the cause of the violence, that they were, stirring their partners up or any of those kinds of things. But I think it is important for us to note that solution-focused brief therapy can have ripple effects, that if we change one part of the system, we inherently then are changing all of the other parts of the system. And this study shows that that is indeed the case. The second little bit down there is the quality of life measures. And they looked at statistical differences between in these various factors. Total quality of life increased at a statistically significant rate. Their vitality increased, their psychological health increased, their bodily pain decreased, their physical functioning increased, and their social functioning increased. So in essence, there were several measures that said their quality of life improved significantly as a result of these 6 short solution-focused sessions. And so in essence, they varied together. As domestic violence incidences decreased, quality of life tended to increase overall. So now quickly at the end here, so what are some of the conclusions that we can draw from this? The rate of psychological, physical, and sexual violence in the intervention group decreased compared to the control group. Now, again, like I mentioned before, this is interesting because the intervention wasn't with the perpetrators of domestic violence, but the rate of violence decreased. One of the conclusions that the authors of the study raised is that potentially the impetus for this was that this intervention raised the victims or the participants' awareness and empowered them. And they concluded that raised awareness and empowerment may have contributed to the outcomes of this study. And then also the quality of life did improve in the intervention group, but also marital conflict decreased as well. So even though they weren't necessarily measuring marital conflict, except for within violence, they did show that marital conflict did decrease overall. So, again, this is a very simple discussion about, does solution-focused brief therapy work with people who have experienced domestic violence? And the finding in essence is, yes, it works. You don't even necessarily have to work with the perpetrator and say, stop perpetuating violence. But instead, we can intervene with one part of the system, and the system overall tends to change. So I think that's a really important finding. The other thing that I think is really important is that relatively quickly, right, within 6 sessions, change can happen for these individuals. And I think it's really valuable to note that the incidences of domestic violence dropped all the way to 0. And so I think that's something that's valuable to think. One of the things, though, that they did mention about that is that potentially as the women became more pregnant, perhaps that also was a signal or a physical manifestation to the partner that they couldn't be violent any longer. So there is potentially a bit of a compound there. But I think that the fact that it got all the way to 0 is something really profound and important. So in the end, can we say solution-focused brief therapy works with people who have experienced domestic violence? Here's one piece of evidence that says that indeed it does work. Now, this is a study that probably needs to be replicated. This is a study that probably needs to be done with lots and lots of other people, and especially women who aren't pregnant or with men who are experiencing domestic violence. But there are other studies that are about solution-focused brief therapy and domestic violence. But this is one caveat that we can stick in to say, yes, indeed, it does have a difference on these women. I'll stop it there. Thank you for being with me for this quick evidence of greatness. I look forward to the next edition. If there are specific studies that you want me to look at or to review, please let me know, send them my way. I'd be happy to share the evidence that you're finding about solution-focused brief therapy, or even about how different characteristics of solution-focused clinicians make a difference, or anything that's related to why does therapy work. So let me know what thoughts you have, and I would be happy to review those studies as well. Have a wonderful day. Let me know what you think.